and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back. Well, not back, but we are starting a new book. This one's called Insurgent Mexico. It is written by a man a journalist who rode along with the revolutionary forces in Mexico during the revolution. We're going to read the preface, which is a short one, and then we're going to read the actual introduction. So, let's go ahead and get into this. In 1862, Emperor Louis Napoleon Bonaparte III of France sent military forces to occupy Mexico. After suffering a defeat at the Battle of Puebla on May the 5th, 1862, celebrated today in Mexico as the holiday of Cinco de Mayo, the French armies crushed the Mexicans and sent the elected president Benito Juarez into exile. In April of 1864, the Austrian aristocrat was installed with French backing as Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. Most nations refused to recognize the new government, and the United States in particular continued to view the government in exile of Benito Juarez, who had fled to the north near the U.S. border, as the legitimate government of Mexico. With American diplomatic backing, Juarez formed an army and captured Mexico City in 1867. Emperor Maximilian was executed, and Juarez assumed office as President of Mexico. In 1871, Juarez was re-elected for another term, an event which brought political opposition from those who argued that president should be limited to just one term, and that re-election to consecutive terms was undemocratic. Then Juarez died in 1872. His vice president, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, assumed office and was himself re-elected in 1876, defeating General Porfirio Diaz, the hero who had beaten the French at the Battle of Puebla. The response to his loss in the election, Diaz organized an armed rebellion, issuing a manifesto known as the Plan of Tehuantepec, which opposed the principle of consecutive terms, repudiated the presidency of Lerdo, and declared Diaz as the legitimate president of Mexico. After a short civil war, Lerdo fled the country, and Porfirio Diaz assumed the presidency in 1877. Despite his campaign against the undemocratic principle of re-election, Diaz promptly took steps to consolidate power in his own hands and crippled his political opponents through repression and outright assassination. Using fraudulent elections and arrests, Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico from 1877 to 1910 as a virtual dictator, either directly or through hand-picked successors from his inner circle. In the 1910 elections, Diaz was opposed by a wealthy banker named Francisco Madero, Madero quickly became wildly popular and had thousands of supporters. Shortly before Election Day, however, Diaz and Madero had several thousand Maduristas arrested, then declared himself the winner of the election by a landslide. A few weeks later, Madero escaped from prison and was smuggled across the border into the United States, where he called upon his followers to launch a rebellion to overthrow Diaz. This was the beginning of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. The Madero Rebellion quickly spread through Mexico. Madurista armies were formed under the command of Francisco Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, Pascual Orozco, and Venustiano Carranza. In 1911, Diaz fled to France, and Madero entered Mexico City, becoming president of Mexico in November. The Maderistas were a loose collection of groups with widely diverging goals, however, ranging from the conservative Orozco to the radicals Villa and Zapata. Villa and Zapata openly called for land reform, in which the large hacienda ranches of the wealthy would be broken up and given to the poor rural peons who worked them for the absentee landowners. In 1912, former Maderista General Orozco, by contrast, launched a rebellion in Chihuahua with the financial backing of the richest landowning family in Mexico to prevent the process of land reform. General Victoriano Huerta, a former follower of Porfirio Diaz, who had become a Maderista, was sent to put down the Orozco rebellion. Although Huerta forced Orozco to flee Mexico in 1912, friction with Pancho Villa over land reform caused Huerta to order Villa's execution, an action which was stopped by President Madero. By 1913, Huerta, along with Felix Diaz, the nephew of the deposed dictator Porfirio Diaz, American Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, and former opponent Pascual Orozco, was planning a military overthrow of President Madero. In February of 1913, after a 10-day siege, President Madero was captured and General Huerta took power. Madero was killed 4 days later, allegedly during a rescue attempt by Maderista forces. Opposition to the Huerta regime soon centered around Venustiano Carranza, who called his insurrectionaries the Constitutionalists. Pancho Villa threw his support behind Carranza in the north, the period of time covered by this book, while Zapata in the south fought against Huerta but refused to back Carranza. In April of 1914, the United States, which had been supporting Carranza, sent troops to seize Veracruz, cutting off the supply of European weapons, mostly from Germany, to the Huertista forces. Huerta fled and Carranza assumed the presidency in July. Within a short time, though, conflict broke out again over the land reform question. When it became clear that Carranza could not carry out any real land reform, both Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata broke away. In October of 1914, 60,000 rebel troops under Villa and Zapata entered Mexico City and forced Carranza to flee. In April of 1915, though, General Alvaro Obregon defeated Pancho Villa in the Battle of Celayes, and Carranza soon returned to Mexico City with the backing of the United States. Villa, in desperation, crossed the border into the United States in March of 1916 and attacked a U.S. Army outpost, hoping to draw the Americans into sending troops into Mexico that would provoke a widespread nationalist uprising. The U.S. sent 10,000 troops under General John Pershing, who would within a few years command the American forces in the First World War, into Mexico, where they unsuccessfully pursued Villa for almost a year. Zapata, meanwhile, was fighting in the south of Mexico, seizing the haciendas and giving them to the poor rural peons under the slogan Land and Liberty. In April of 1919, one of Carranza's generals, Pablo Gonzalez, sent word to Zapata that he wished to defect to the Zapatistas. When Zapata arrived for discussions, he was ambushed and killed by the general's troops. Carranza himself was assassinated by political rivals, including his former general Obregon in 1920. Pancho Villa continued to fight with a small army until 1923, when he was ambushed while riding in a car through the town of Parral on the border. Mercado's Federal Army, after its dramatic and terrible retreat 400 miles across the desert when Chihuahua was abandoned, lay 3 months at Ojinaga on the Rio Grande. At Presidio, on the American side of the river, one could climb to the flat mud roof of the post office and look across the mile or so of low scrub growing in the sand to the shallow yellow stream, and beyond to the low mesa where the town was, sticking sharply up out of a scorched desert, ringed around with bare savage mountains. One could see the square gray adobe houses of Ojinga, with here and there the oriental cupola of an old Spanish church. It was a desolate land, without trees. You expected minarets. By day, federal soldiers in shabby white uniforms swarmed about the place, desolately digging trenches, for Villa and his victorious constitutionalists were rumored to be on the way. You got sudden glints where the sun dashed on the field. Guns, strange thick clouds of smoke rose straight in the still air. Toward evening, when the sun went down with the flare of a blast furnace, patrols of cavalry rode sharply across the skyline to the night outpost, and after dark mysterious fires burned in the town. There were 5,500 men in Ojinaga. This was all that remained of Mercado's army of 10,000 and the 5,000 which Pascual Orozco had marched north from Mexico City to reinforce him. Of the 3,500, 45 were majors, 21 colonels, and 11 generals. I wanted to interview General Mercado, but one of the newspapers had printed something displeasing to General Salazar, and he had forbidden the reporters the town. I sent a polite request to General Mercado. The note was intercepted by General Roscoe, who sent back the following reply. Esteemed and honored sir, if you set foot inside Ojinaga, I will stand you sideways against the wall and with my own hand take great pleasure in shooting furrows in your back. But after all, I waded the river one day and went up into the town. Luckily, I did not meet General Roscoe. No one seemed to object to my entrance. All the sentries I saw were taking a siesta on the sunny side of adobe walls. But almost immediately I encountered a courteous officer named Hernandez, to whom I explained that I wished to see General Mercado. Without inquiring as to my identity, he scowled, folded his arms, and burst out, I am General Roscoe's chief of staff, and I will not take you to see General Mercado. I said nothing. In a few minutes he explained, General Roscoe hates General Mercado. He does not deign to go to General Mercado's cuartel, and General Mercado does not dare to come to General Roscoe's cuartel. He is a coward. He ran away from Tierra Blanca, and then he ran away from Chihuahua. What other generals don't you like? I asked. He caught himself and slanted an angry look at me and then grinned. Quien sabe? I saw General Mercado, a fat, pathetic, worried, undecided little man who blubbered and blustered a long tale about how the United States Army had come across the river and helped Villa to win the Battle of Tierra Blanca. The white, dusty streets of the town piled high with filth and fodder, the ancient windowless church with its 3 enormous Spanish bells hanging on a rack outside, and a cloud of blue incense crawling out of the black doorway where the women camp followers of the army prayed for victory day and night, lay in hot, breathless sun. 5 times had Ojinaga been lost and taken. Hardly a house that had a roof, and all the walls gaped with cannon shot. In these bare, gutted rooms lived the soldiers, their women, their horses, their chickens and pigs, raided from the surrounding country. Guns were stacked in the corners, saddles piled in the dust, and soldiers were in rags. Scarcely one possessed a complete uniform. They squared around little fires in their doorways, boiling corn husks and dried meat. They were almost starving. Along the main street passed an unbroken procession of sick, exhausted, starving people, driven from the interior by fear of the approaching rebels, a journey of 8 days over the most terrible desert in the world. They were stopped by 100 soldiers along the street and robbed of every possession that took the Federals' fancy. Then they passed on to the river, and on the American side they had to run the gauntlet of the U.S. Customs and Immigration officials and the Army Border Patrol, who searched them for arms. Hundreds of refugees poured across the river, some on horseback driving cattle before them, some in wagons, and others on foot. The inspectors were not very gentle. "Come down off that wagon," one would shout to a Mexican woman with a bundle in her arms. "But, senor, for what reason?" she would begin. "Come down there or I'll pull you down," he would yell. They made an unnecessarily careful and brutal search of the men and of the women too. As I stood there, a woman waded across the ford, her skirts lifted unconcernedly to her thighs. She wore a voluminous shawl, which was humped up in front as if she was carrying something in it. "Hi there," shouted a customs man. "What have you got under your shawl?" She slowly opened the front of her dress and answered placidly, "I don't know, senor. It may be a girl or it may be a boy." These were metropolitan days for Presidio, a straggling and indescribably desolate village of about 15 adobe houses scattered without much plan in the deep sand and cottonwood scrub along the river bottom. Old Kleinman, the German storekeeper, made a fortune a day outfitting refugees and supplying the federal army across the river with provisions. He had 3 beautiful adolescent daughters, whom he kept locked up in the attic of the store because a flock of amorous Mexicans and ardent cowpunchers prowled around like dogs, drawn from many miles away by the fame of these damsels. Half the time he spent working furiously in the store, stripped to the waist, and the remainder rushing around with a large gun strapped to his waist, warning off the suitors. But all times of the day and night, throngs of unarmed federal soldiers from across the river swarmed in the store and the pool hall. Among them circulated dark, ominous persons with an important air, secret agents of the rebels and the Federals. Around in the brush camped hundreds of destitute refugees, and you could not walk around a corner at night without stumbling over a plot or a counterplot. There were Texas Rangers and U.S. troopers and agents of American corporations trying to get secret instructions to their employees in the interior. One Mackenzie stamped about the post office in a high dudgeon. It appeared that he had important letters for the American Smelting and Refining Company mines in Santa Eulalia. Old Mercado insists on operating and reading all letters that pass through his lines. He shouted indignantly. "But," I said, "he will let them pass, won't he?" "Certainly," he answered. "But do you think the American Smelting and Refining Company will submit to having its letters opened and read by a damned greaser? It's an outrage when an American corporation can't send a private letter to its employees. If this don't bring intervention," he finished darkly, "I don't know what will." There were all sorts of drummers for arms and ammunition companies, smugglers and contrabandistas, Also a small Bantam man, the salesman for a portrait company which made crayon enlargements from photographs at $5 a piece. He was scurrying around among the Mexicans getting thousands of orders for pictures which were to be paid for upon delivery and which, of course, would never be delivered. Could never be delivered. It was his first experience among Mexicans, and he was highly gratified by the hundreds of orders he had received. You see, a Mexican would just as soon order a portrait or a piano or an automobile as not, so long as he does not have to pay for it. It gives him a sense of wealth. The little agent for crayon enlargements made one comment on the Mexican Revolution. He said that General Huerta must be a fine man because he understood he was distantly connected on his mother's side with the distinguished Carey family of Virginia. The American Bank of the river was patrolled twice a day by details of cavalry conscientiously paralleled on the Mexican side by companies of horsemen. Both parties watched each other narrowly across the border. Every once in a while, a Mexican, unable to restrain his nervousness, took a pot shot at the Americans, and a small battle ensued as both parties scattered into the brush. A little way above Presidio were stationed two troops of the Negro Ninth Cavalry. One colored trooper, watering his horse on the bank of the river, was accosted by an English-speaking Mexican squatting on the opposite shore. "Hey, coon," he shouted derisively. "When are you damned gringos going to cross that line?" "Chile," responded the Negro. "We ain't a-going to cross that line at all. We're just going to pick up the line and carry it right down to the big ditch." Sometimes a rich refugee with a good deal of gold sewed in his saddle blankets would get across the river without the Federals discovering it. There were 6 big high-power automobiles in Presidio waiting for just such a victim. They would soak him $100 gold to make a trip to the railroad, and on the way, somewhere in the desolate waste south of Marfa, he was almost sure to be held up by masked men and everything taken away from him. Upon these occasions, the High Sheriff of Presidio County would bluster into town on a small pinto horse, a figure true to the best tradition of the girl of the Golden West. He had read all Owen Wister's novels and knew that a Western sheriff ought to look like one. 2 revolvers on the hip, one slung under his arm, and a large knife in his left boot, and an enormous shotgun over his saddle. His conversation was larded with the most fearful oaths, and he never caught any criminal. He spent all of his time enforcing Presidio County law against carrying firearms, and could always find him sitting in at a quiet game in the back of Kleinman's store. War and rumors of war kept Presidio at a fever heat. We all knew that sooner or later the Constitutionalist Army would come overland from Chihuahua and attack Ojinaga. In fact, the major in command of the Border Patrol had already been approached by the federal generals in a body to make arrangements for the retreat of the federal army from Ojinaga under such circumstances. They said that when the rebels attacked, they would want to resist for a respectable length of time, say 2 hours, and that then they would like permission to come across the river. We knew that some 25 miles southward at La Mula Pass, 500 rebel volunteers guarded the only road from Ojinaga through the mountains. One day, a courier sneaked through the federal lines and across the river with important news. He said that the military band of the federal army had been marching around the country practicing their music and had been captured by the Constitutionalists, who stood them up in the marketplace with rifles pointed at their heads and made them play 12 hours at a stretch. Thus, continued the message, the hardships of life in the desert have been somewhat alleviated. We could never discover just how it was that the band happened to be practicing all alone 22 miles from Ojinaga in the desert. For a month longer, the Federals remained at Ojinaga and Presidio throve. Then Villa, at the head of his army, appeared over a rise of the desert. The Federals resisted a respectable length of time, just 2 hours, or to be exact, until Villa himself, at the head of the battery, galloped right up to the muzzles of the guns and then poured across the river in wild rout. We're headed in a vast corral by the American soldiers and afterward imprisoned in a barbed wire stockade at Fort Bliss, Texas. But by that time I was already far down in Mexico, riding across the desert with 100 ragged Constitutionalist troopers on my way to the front. But that'll end the beginning here. Next episode, we get in part 1, Desert War. Yeah. So we get an introduction to what is going on. Remember, 1910, we have the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. This would go on until, I believe they said 1923. Yeah. It was a lengthy revolution. But yeah, this is the days of Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata. This is their actual revolution. It's equivalent to the U.S. Revolution in that manner, where they're fighting for freedoms, and that was the revolution that brought about modern Mexico. But yeah, again, we're talking the decade of 1910 through the early 1920s. So keep that in mind. I know there are some very despicable words used, but yeah, you got to remember the age in when this was written. I mean, we're still talking. We weren't even yet in World War One. But yeah, uh, we see a lot of other big names mentioned. Yeah, Napoleon III sends troops to conquer Mexico. They suffer a defeat at the Battle of Puebla on May the 5th, 1862, which is the holiday of Cinco de Mayo. I know a lot of people try to say, "Oh, it's Mexican Revolution when they won their independence." No, no, no. Cinco de Mayo is not that. It's the remembrance of when the Mexican people defeated the French. But the French would end up taking over and installing Maximilian the First, the only emperor of Mexico. Uh, at that point, they had been led by Benito Juarez. Eventually, they would defeat Emperor Maximilian. He would be executed and Juarez reinstated. After his being elected for another term, Juarez died. His vice president, Sebastian Lerdo de Tejada, would take over and would get reelected himself. And this is when a lot of the troubles really begin. A lot of the people wanted to rule as emperors instead of just presidents. So yeah, there were a lot of battles. It was between Porfirio Diaz and Lerdo. Sebastian Lerdo, I think it was de Tejada, I said it was. Yeah. But yeah, we would get a lot of battles here. Lerdo was pushed out. Diaz assumes control, but Lerdo had fled. He hadn't been assassinated or anything. Porfirio Diaz, rules with an iron fist. Ruling from 1877 to 1910. In 1910, Diaz was opposed by Francisco Madero. And yeah. Now, we also see a lot of the people trying to take over are the wealthier people in Mexico. Madero himself was a wealthy banker. You know, the problem's always caused by the rich and big money. But yeah. But he would get help from another number of other people Pascual Orozco, Venustiano Carranza, and the ones who were more representative of the people, Francisco Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Yeah. This would end up forcing Diaz, who had ruled as a dictator, to flee, going to France. But that was in 1911. Everything falls apart. While they all worked together to kick Diaz out, things started to deteriorate. As I said, freaking Madero himself was a wealthy banker. He became president during revolution. General Orozco in 1912 launches his own rebellion with the financial backing of the richest landowning family in Mexico. That's a big thing we need to remember. There's a lot of big landowners, so. Victoriano Huerta is sent to put down the Orozco rebellion. So yeah, Orozco is forced to flee in 1912, but there is now friction with Pancho Villa because Villa, as I've already said, Villa and Zapata are more representative of the people. They wanted all the possessed land by the rich to be spread back out to the people, to everybody. So yeah. But because Villa was so adamant over this, he gets a demand for his execution placed on his head, but it would be prevented by President Madero. But Victoriano Huerta would then side with Felix Diaz, who is the nephew of Porfirio Diaz, the guy who was the dictator, and his former opponent, Orozco, and they would work to try to overthrow Madero with the help of an American. As always, America's sticking its nose in all this. When it don't have to, it does. Madero is captured, Huerta takes power, Madero is then killed. So yeah, we start seeing all these changes. Different leaders, different leaders, different leaders. Huerta's regime focused against Venustiano Carranza, who was one of the big guys after they uh, first kicked out Porfirio Diaz. Carranza called his insurrectionaries, his actual fighters, constitutionalists. Pancho Villa threw his support in with Carranza. And that's during the time covered in this book. So like I said, this is still before World War One. So yeah. Zapata would be in the south. He would fight against Huerta, but he wouldn't necessarily join Carranza. Then the U.S. itself supported Carranza, sent troops into Veracruz to try to cut off European weapons. Huerta would be defeated and flee, and next, Venustiano Carranza would become president. Again, more battle over the land reform question, because remember, Villa and Zapata were all for giving land to the people. But Carranza didn't want to do it, and so they both broke away from Carranza, turned against him. And Villa and Zapata would enter Mexico City. Carranza would be forced to flee. Obregon enters the picture. He defeats Pancho Villa at the Battle of Celayas, and Carranza is returned to Mexico City with the backing of the U.S. Villa pushes a desperate measure and wants to push the battle into America, so they would try to send troops into Mexico, thus turning the people against the U.S. The U.S. would send about 10,000 troops under General John Pershing. His nickname is General Blackjack Pershing. So yeah. And as we've already discussed, he would lead the U.S. forces in World War I. They were unsuccessful in their attempt to catch Pancho Villa for almost a year. Zapata was in the south, taking these big land places, the haciendas, and dividing them up, giving them to the poor, the rural people, under the slogan Land and Liberty. Carranza has his general, Pablo Gonzalez, send word to Zapata that he wished to, Pablo Gonzalez himself, who was a general of Carranza, sent word to Zapata that he wanted to defect and join him, but it was a setup. Zapata was ambushed and killed when he showed up. Carranza would end up being assassinated, even though he was president, by political rivals, including General Alvaro Obregon. Pancho Villa would continue his fight until 1923, when he was ambushed while riding a car through the town of Parral. So yeah, that's a nice synopsis of how the actual Mexican Revolution goes. And then the On the Border tells us how things work, how a more in-depth, in-person situation. But yeah, you have the rich landowning peoples who own the haciendas. You know, they're often pulling the strings, but Villa and Zapata are average people, and they want, land reform. It's like, we can't just have it all in the hands of just a few people. Spread it out amongst the people. And at the end of the war, we would have Alvaro Obregon kind of being the lead of everything. And I have a biography of Obregon if I ever do decide to bring that in and read that. But yeah, I think it was just a Mexican history class. It may have been part of my Latin American history, but I had some history classes on this, and so there's a bit of information here. Again, you have to understand the book. The information itself is written during the time. So I apologize for some of the language that may end up being used, but I want to try to give you all the full feeling of how it is. Yeah. We will be reading of the little dispatches given out by the newspaper man as he rides along with Pancho Villa and his group. So yeah. Pancho Villa. Anyway, this has been a long freaking video to start it out with, but it gives us a background. I'll end the episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.